Another aspect of the economic crisis here in the city of Detroit is the crisis in education. Something that just didn't start, but it has accelerated over the last several years. The city of Detroit has a public school system that's virtually bankrupt right now. The reason why it's bankrupt largely derives from several factors. The large unemployment rate. When people are unemployed, as I mentioned before, they have a problem with maintaining their mortgages, and the foreclosure rates go up. School financing for many, many years was dependent upon property tax revenues generated from people who own their own homes. It's a little bit different now because they also use sales tax revenues to help fund public education in the state of Michigan. But even sales tax revenues are far down as a result of the high unemployment and underemployment here in the city of Detroit and throughout the state of Michigan. So consequently, there's not enough funds from individual households through property taxes and also through consumers in regard to sales tax revenues. So just about all of the school systems throughout the state of Michigan are in crisis. It's not just the city of Detroit. It had been the city of Detroit for many, many years because we had a high unemployment rate, we had a problem of deindustrialization, and we had a problem of unequal distribution of educational funding, which largely is determined by racist funding processes, where in Bloomfield Hills, you can have 2 to 3 times as much funding going per student for education as you would have in the city of Detroit or the city of Highland Park, the city of Pontiac, or the city of Flint. So we have large-scale unemployment, large-scale home foreclosures, a crisis in education. What has highlighted the crisis in education recently was a state takeover about a decade ago by a conservative Republican administration under John English. Actually, the city of Detroit's public education system in 1999 had a surplus. There was no deficit. There was a $1.5 billion bond proposal that was passed during that same year that was designed to provide capital improvements to the schools. Because most of the schools in the city of Detroit were built many, many years ago, back during the early part of the 20th century and the mid-20th century. So the schools were in dire need of repair, monumental repairs. So the citizens in Detroit, who have a history and a legacy of taxing themselves to subsidize the losses in tax revenue, this actually started taking place under the Coleman Young administration during the 1970s and 1980s, where people were actually willing to tax themselves to help finance public education and also public services. So in the late 1990s, the voters here in the city of Detroit voted to tax themselves to the tune of $1.5 billion in order to improve the school system here in the city. Well, when you had a conservative administration in Lansing, they created a crisis. They said there was a deteriorating public education system here in the city of Detroit. Now, granted, it was bad, but it did not warrant a state takeover. This is what took place in 1999. When this state takeover took place, as I mentioned, the Detroit public school system had a surplus. They also had a $1.5 billion bond to improve the conditions and the infrastructure of the Detroit public school system. The state of Michigan maintained control of the public school system for 5 years here in the city of Detroit. And after they gave the school system back, now people fought against this takeover. There were lawsuits, there were mass demonstrations, there was mass organizing that went on between 1999 and 2004. The state turned the school system back over to the city in 2004, and when they turned it back over, it was virtually bankrupt. They had wasted all the money. With private contractors, they had given money to supposedly do school improvement, and the improvements really never got done, and a lot of the money was actually stolen. On top of that, a lot of people took their children out of the public school system because of the chaos that was going on, and they started putting students into these charter schools that came in very strong beginning in the late 1990s and the early part of the 2000s. So by the time the citizens of the city of Detroit got their school system back in 2004 and 2005, it was in dire financial crisis at that time, and it's worsened over the last 5 years. Also, the final point, and there are many, many others, the question of political repression and police terrorism. This is another aspect of the economic crisis. In the city of Detroit, we have a serious problem, have had a serious problem with police brutality. In fact, in 1967, when the rebellion broke out, it was sparked by police terrorism against the people, against the African American community on the west side of Detroit. That has continued. There was a massive struggle against police repression during the late 1960s and early 1970s. As a result of that, in large part, the first African American mayor was elected to the city of Detroit in 1973. His name was Coleman Young. He was a veteran labor organizer and also a leftist, had close connections with the Communist Party USA. He was an organizer for the National Negro Labor Councils, which was a very radical, militant labor organization that formed in the aftermath of World War II to fight against institutionalized discrimination and racism in the labor market, in the auto plants, and also in the public sector. So in 1973, we got an African American mayor in the city of Detroit. He was very outspoken against racism. He immediately eliminated this decoy police unit called Stress. And he also instituted a massive affirmative action program involving the public sector in the city of Detroit, as well as the police and the fire department. So consequently, thousands of African Americans and women got jobs within the city administration during the 1970s and 1980s as a result of these political changes that had taken place in the city of Detroit. Because Coleman Young was such an outspoken critic of police repression and racism, there was essentially a blockade against the city after he was elected in 1973. There was virtually no investment, private investment, very little private investment into the city of Detroit. In fact, after 1979, all of the investment virtually dried up from outside into the city of Detroit. So we had more businesses, more households falling into greater distress. Also during this time period, we had the phenomena of what is now known as deindustrialization, for use of a better term. Because of the strength of the labor movement in the city of Detroit, the strength of the African American political constituency here in the city of Detroit, a lot of industrialists took their businesses, closed their factories here, and moved them to other areas of the United States and other areas of the world, because these areas were not as well organized, didn't have as strong labor unions, and didn't have as, in often cases, as militant constituency, political constituencies as existed in the city of Detroit. So this, in fact, did a lot to damage the economic situation here in the city. Now, in the second phase of this discussion, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of the city of Detroit, particularly during the 20th century. Now, even in the 19th century, Detroit was a hub for the Underground Railroad. In fact, if you go over here to the Hart Plaza, there's a monument to the Underground Railroad at the base of Hart Plaza, right on the Detroit River, which is right across from Canada. A lot of Africans who escaped from slavery in the South fled to the city of Detroit because it was just right across the river from Canada. And if they could get to Canada, particularly after 1833, when the British abolished slavery in their territories, they were able to live free. And there was a huge African population in Canada, particularly in Ontario, during the period of slavery. In places like Chatham, Buxton, there were large African-American communities that were there. They had their own newspapers, they had anti-slavery societies and abolitionist organizations that were very well organized in Canada. Now, after the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the United States, a lot of those people left Canada and came back into the United States. Some of them even went back into the South. At the turn of the 19th and 20th century, we had a tremendous rise in industrialization in Detroit. Prior to that time period, Detroit was a lumber producing area. There was a lot of trading going on in terms of the fur industry as well. But beginning in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we had a huge growth in industrialization in Detroit.